In 1626, the new Netherlands director of the Dutch West India Company, Peter Minuit, had leased the island Mannahatta Anung from a Mansi tribe in exchange for goods worth 60 guilders and a mutual assistance treaty. He established a new settlement around Fort Amsterdam and called it Nieuw Amsterdam, New Amsterdam. The new Netherlands colony grew steadily as more and more settlers arrived to engage in the lucrative fur trade. But developing a new company colony was hard, and the men put in charge of running it were, let's just say, not quite up to the task. I'm Yvette, this is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 2 of the story of New Amsterdam, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. Please support the channel by liking, subscribing, sharing, and letting me know your thoughts as they happen in the comments section. Links to my sources, the music, and other ways to support Defragged History are in the description. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. New Netherland was chugging along. The trade was good, the crops were growing, the Indians were great pals. But then, things hit a snag in the summer of 1626. Fort Orange on the North or Hudson River was built on some abandoned hunting grounds of the Mahican, with Mohawk territory to the north and west of it. The Mahican relocated some of their villages to be closer to the Dutch, and they became best buds. The Dutch figured the tribe had moved closer just to streamline the fur trade. Well, yes, but they were actually looking for protection. The Algonquin Mahican and the Haudenosaunee Mohawk had been in an on-again, off-again war for decades. But just as things calmed down, the Dutch arrived. The Swanakins brought stuff, useful stuff. And, well, fights broke out again, with the Mohawk pushing the Mahican further away. Late summer of 1626, over a dozen Mahican entered Fort Orange. The leader, Moneman, asked the fort's commander Daniel van Kriekenbeek to help them fight the Mohawk. I don't know, fellas. The company's orders were explicit. He shall be very careful not lightly to embroil himself in the Indians' quarrels or wars, or to take sides, but to remain neutral. Still, van Kriekenbeek was in the middle of nowhere and had to ensure the safety of the men, women and children in and around Fort Orange. Plus, they were on Mahican land. Contract is contract. It's the merchant's way. Van Kriekenbeek and 6 soldiers followed the Mahican toward Mohawk territory. 3 miles into their trek, they were caught in an arrow storm flying at them from every direction. The Mohawk were mad that the Dutch had sided with their enemies. The attack left van Kriekenbeek, 3 of his men, and 24 Mahican, including Moneman, dead. Director Peter Minuit of the West India Company sent merchant and polyglot Pieter Barendszoon up the North River toward Fort Orange to inquire into the disaster caused by the reckless adventure of Kriekenbeek. Barends assured the Mohawk that van Kriekenbeek had acted on his own and against company orders. Eventually, the big boss Minuit sailed upriver himself to convince the Mohawk the Dutch meant them no harm. The duo quickly made peace with the Mohawk and established an alliance. At the fort, there were 8 families and 10 or 12 seamen in the company's service. Either the Mohawk convinced Minuit to remove the colonists, or the director figured the place wasn't safe anymore because he recalled them all to New Amsterdam. The families were to leave there this year, the fort there to remain garrisoned by 16 men without women, in order to strengthen with people the colony near the Manhattan. Minuit replaced the unfortunate van Kriekenbeek with Bastiaan Janszoon Krol, who'd served at the fort as a ziekentrooster, the comforter of the sick, for 2 years. Krol had developed a strong bond with the Indians and was well acquainted with the language. As a lay minister, not a member of the clergy, he'd not been allowed to perform sacraments or baptize children. Krol petitioned the company on behalf of the colonists to send a legitimate reverend. In turn, the company petitioned the church to give Krol permission to baptize and marry people, which they did. By the end of July, Director Minuit was back in New Amsterdam, hoping to turn the place into the capital of the yet-to-be-defined New Netherland colony. The company had ordered a fort be built according to certain specifications on the southwestern corner of Manhattan Island, but Minuit didn't have enough men to build it, so the director ordered a redesign. Fort Amsterdam would be a blockhouse fortified with red cedar palisades, earthen ramparts, and 4 instead of 5 bastions. In the Republic, stadtholder and military commander Prince Maurits of Orange had turned fort and camp building into an art form. The VOC colonizers had successfully adopted the prince's model for their settlements, but the WIC colonizers seemed completely lost. Even before construction was completed, the ramparts were crumbling, but no one seemed in a particular rush to rebuild them. Incidentally, you can still see the shape of the old fort today in the floor plan of the Customs House across from Battery Park in New York City. The fort was supposed to include a commander's building and other nice things, but Minuit used the materials instead to build 30 houses with thatched roofs and wooden chimneys along the beach. Houses were in great demand, and Minuit scored brownie points with the colonists with this move. As every merchant ship dumped their slender yellow bricks it used as ballast on the way in upon arrival, the number of brick houses increased, but at this point, the only brick building was the West India Company's HQ and warehouse. There was no dock yet either, and the many goods and people arriving on huge merchant ships had to be rowed across in skiffs. During the 2 to 3 month voyage across, emigrants paid 12.5 cents a day for fare and food. Once at the colony, they were granted as much land as they were able to cultivate. While the English colonies had a monoculture, New Amsterdam, like the Dutch Republic, was a melting pot of different people with Angolans, Italians, Poles, Danes, and North African Arabs. Anyone was welcome. Mo trade, mo money. However, most new arrivals weren't interested in farming or construction. They were there to trade. This lack of manpower created a lot of problems, such as a fort not being built or crops not being grown and harvested. A notable newcomer was a son of the infamous Dutch Barbary pirate turned Muslim Jan Jansen van Haarlem. Speaking of pirates, many pirates, or privateers depending on their legal status, cruised along the Spanish Main, the South American coast, and the Caribbean, hunting for Spanish and Portuguese ships to loot, and made New Amsterdam, the best port in North America, their loot-dumping port. Many pirates became privateers during times of war, which is just a legal form of pirating. Privateers carried letters of marque, government-issued permission papers allowing them to rob any enemy vessel blind. They brought cases of indigo, sugar, and pieces of eight, but also confiscated slaves bound for the Caribbean salt fields. While the company wasn't involved in the slave trade at this point, some of the Africans became slaves in the West India Company's service. Others worked for their freedom, or were employed as freedmen from the start. The most famous pirate/privateer was Abraham Blauvelt, and later his son Willem. Piracy and privateering were legitimate businesses that came with a proper administration, and so Blauvelt dutifully reported his log with the New Netherlands Secretary Isaac de Razière. Prominent New Amsterdam folk became Blauvelt's patrons, investing in his pirate missions for a cut of the stolen loot. All this riffraff led to a boom in breweries, taverns, and brothels. Within a few years, a quarter of New Amsterdam's buildings were all about the alcohol. Most taverns were located in an area that is still New York City's entertainment center today. Yet, with all the alcohol flowing and illegal trade increasing, crime rates went up. And there was really no one around to deal with it. New Amsterdam residents were more employees than citizens, so there was no official legal system and no real government. The company's ship rules became land rules, but it soon proved unworkable for the landlubbers. Every Thursday, Minuit, de Razière, and the Council of Five met in a room in the decaying fort to play pretend government. They heard disputes, issued orders, and Minuit's law enforcement officer, an Englishman named John Lamb, presented the council with all kinds of criminal issues plaguing the colony. They made new laws on the fly. Rules for curfews, alcohol sales, barroom brawls, adultery, interracial relations, lewd behavior, and violence. New Amsterdam had no prison yet, so the punishments were creative. Branding, whipping, ear removal, tongue piercing, and hanging were meant to scare everyone into good behavior. However, sentences were often reduced, because they couldn't afford to lose the few workers they had. In fact, many Walloons returned to the Republic after their 6-year service. The company had changed the trading conditions on them, they weren't happy about being recalled to New Amsterdam, the government was non-existent, proper justice was laughably absent, and there was no entertainment. Back in the Republic, some even sued the company for what they felt had been a bait-and-switch. Peter Minuit, while a capable strategist, was no leader, no lawman, and no reverend. Secretary de Razière was equally powerless, but at least he tried. Once he caught council member Gerrit Vongerszoon trading with the Indians on the sly. Defrauding the company was a serious crime. De Razière threatened to confiscate his property on behalf of the company and fine him, but Vongers replied, "I do not consider you are a big enough man for that." Chaos mounted. The English settlement Jamestown in Virginia to the south was a trading colony just like New Netherland, relying on a private company for jobs and help. To the north, the New Plymouth colony, founded by the English Puritan separatists, or Pilgrims as we know them today, were independent folk who had fled religious persecution. They expected no help and were determined to make it on their own. Their colony wasn't exactly prosperous. Most of the time, the Pilgrims were hanging on for dear life. Fur trading was the colony's main source of income, but they'd had a few nasty run-ins with the Indians, and, well, it wasn't going swimmingly. They tried to supplement their income by fishing in Cape Cod, but they lacked the skills, and their economic hardship persisted. On March 9, 1627, Director Minuit sent a letter of friendship to New Plymouth's government and Governor William Bradford. Noble, worshipful, wise, and prudent lords, the governor and councillors residing in New Plymouth are very good friends. The Director and Council of New Netherland wish to your lordships, worshipful, wise, and prudent, happiness in Christ Jesus our Lord, with prosperity and health in soul and body. Amen. The Dutch tended to go a little overboard with the salutations. If ever they needed anything at all, they should just ask. We got you covered. But first, let's establish good commercial relations. England and the Republic have been good friends for centuries, and your king just made a treaty with our States General to stamp out the Spanish Roman Catholics together. What do you say? Besties? Governor Bradford replied to the New Netherland director, "To the honored, etc. Not as worthy a salutation. We remember and thank you again for your hospitality in Leiden before our arrival here. So sure, best buds and trade. Just don't go trading with the locals in our territory, Kay?" And by our territory, he also meant New Netherland. Well, I have never. And we didn't immediately send a reply, because something had changed in the old country. England and France got into a bit of a fight, well, a war. King Charles I of England had fired all his wife Queen Henriette Marie's French servants. The Queen's brother, King Louis XIII of France, had a totally mature response to this violation of the Marriage Act by seizing 120 English ships in French harbors. Charles, not one to rise above it, declared war on France. However, he hadn't asked his recalled Parliament's permission, so he had no money to wage it. Meanwhile, England and France both tried to get the Republic to choose their side in the war. Protestant England told them they owed it to the Protestants and they owed it to the English because Amboina Massacre, the execution of English merchants by the VOC on the East Indian spice island of Umbul. While Roman Catholic France tried to bribe the Republic with sweet talk, money, and more support in their war against the Spanish king. But the Republic refused to pick a side. 3 months after receiving the last letter, Director Minuit wrote Governor Bradford the most polite letter on behalf of the States General and the Prince of Orange. So, the Dutch have been trading in the area for over 26 years, and if you come at me, we'll defend ourselves. Please send someone over to talk mutual commerce and trading, or we'll send someone over to you. Minuit sent along a gift, a rundlet of sugar and 2 Holland cheeses. You know, just to rub it in their starving faces. Bradford answered, "Fine, we'll make an agreement. But don't you dare go fishing within our territory or we'll confiscate the ships. And we've been here for 40 years, so there." Bradford had to admit that they must remain your debtors until another time, not having anything to send you for the present that may be acceptable. The governor couldn't send an ambassador to Fort Amsterdam either because one of our boats is abroad and we have much business at home. Oh, you're too poor to send a gift or have another ship? Yeah, very sad. We'll send someone over. Let me go find a ship among the dozens in our harbor. On September 30th, 1627, Director Minuit sent Secretary de Rasières to New Plymouth on the Nassau. The plan was to establish friendly relations, but to show they weren't kidding around, a small band of soldiers and some trumpeters went along. On October 4th, the Nassau entered Plymouth territory for a joyful visit, celebrating the friendship between England and the Republic. They agreed to help each other in case of a French attack, which, well, benefited the Dutch more than the English. The Dutch also taught Bradford about sawant or wampum pack, what the Dutch considered the currency of the area. It wasn't, but it became that anyway. Wampum were belts made of polished seashells. The higher the quality of the shells, the higher the value. Governor Bradford once again thanked the Dutch for their hospitality during their time in Leiden, but again asserted the right of the English to the country claimed by the Dutch. The Dutch shouldn't even try to colonize these regions, or things might get very unpleasant, soonish, once they got their act together. And so, trade relations remained unsettled until the English representative, who had just sailed to England, returned. The Dutch wisely swallowed their threats of violence and wrote King Charles directly. Charles issued an order that all the English ports, both in his kingdom and his territories, should be thrown open to the Dutch vessels trading to or from New Netherland. Overruled. In 1628, Secretary de Rasières also gave up on the colony and returned to Old Amsterdam. He told the company about the lawlessness of New Netherland, and, by the way, everyone was swearing and cussing to their heart's content. The company knew they had to act at once. Did they send a governor? Nope. Did they send a lawman? Nope. They send a reverend, a wonderful ray of sunshine to bring leadership and encouragement. Except there was no sunshine, no leadership, and no encouragement. The grumpy Reverend Jonas Michaelius, sent for a 3-year term, was utterly unimpressed about the whole colony thing. In his bitter letters home, he complained about the stormy journey over, the climate with the sudden changes of cold and heat, the sun is very warm, the winter is strong and severe. He'd arrived from a land flowing with milk, cheese, and eggs, but was forced to live off ship's rations, beans, peas, barley, and stockfish, because it was all so expensive. He felt the settlers were rough and unrestrained, and the natives were entirely savage and wild, strangers to all decency, yea, uncivil and stupid as garden poles, proficient in all wickedness and godlessness, devilish men, who served nobody but the devil. Gee, tell us what you really think. To be fair, his wife died only a few weeks after arriving, leaving him to care for their 3 little daughters without a maid. Either way, he wasn't exactly an influencer for those back home. We lead a hard and sober existence, like poor people. Still, he went to work and founded the first fully organized church before either English colony had one, with a salaried minister, a board, and a baptized congregation. The Reverend Peter Minuit, Bastiaan Krol, and Minuit's brother-in-law Jan Huygen were all church board members. This National Reformed Church of the Netherlands held services at Fort Amsterdam in the attic of the horse mill. After a rough start, admirals of the West India Company led several successful campaigns against the Spanish and Portuguese fleets and colonies in the Americas. In 1624, they captured ports in Brazil and seized a ton of loot, but the Spanish quickly fitted out an armada and drove out the Dutch a year later. The West India Company's biggest heist was on September 8, 1628, when Admiral Pieter Hein captured a section of the Spanish silver fleet in the Bay of Matanzas on the Cuban coast. The current estimates of the purchasing power of the loot was $500 million in today's dollars. There was great rejoicing in the Republic over this victory, and much wailing in Spain. The money allowed Commander-in-Chief of the Dutch army, Prince Frederik Hendrik of Orange, to besiege and capture the Swamp Dragon, 's-Hertogenbosch, a strategic Roman Catholic stronghold in the south of the Netherlands. The town's loss was such a blow to the Spanish that they once again tried to make peace with the Republic. But the VOC and the WIC fiercely resisted. The companies were only just getting started. In February 1630, the West India Company, funded by the Silver Fleet's capture, sent Admiral Hendrik Lonck with 67 ships and 7,000 men to seize Pernambuco in the north of Brazil, today's Recife. From there, the Dutch slowly started driving out the Portuguese by seizing places left and right. Spain was really not happy. and Portugal even less. This is what they got for being ruled by the King of Spain. England was also not thrilled with the hungry hippo Dutch. King Charles I of England regarded the Dutch as mad rebels who deposed a God-appointed king. Now the thriving republic was out there, proving to everyone that the people could in fact rule themselves. It set a dangerous precedent. His subjects might get the wrong idea and depose him. He was even more angry that the Dutch controlled the world's trade in sugar, spices, and textiles, pushing out the English everywhere. Around this time, a new colony arose north of New Netherland and north of New Plymouth, at today's Boston. Some Puritans gave up on reforming the Church of England back home and figured the only way to be true English Christians was to start their own colony in the New World. King Charles had granted a colonial charter to the Massachusetts Bay Company, and in June 1630, Governor John Winthrop and his 700 Puritan colonists arrived to build a city upon a hill, a New Jerusalem. They would teach the natives all about their almighty God, and they'd better believe it, or else. Then the king discovered that the English colonies in the Americas were not nearly as ideally located as New Netherland. Charles wanted to annex the lot, but without Parliament, once more dismissed, he had no access to money to send over troops who could kick out the Dutch. Instead, he had lawyers figure out how he could legally claim that the New Netherland territory was actually in English possession. The ideas they came up with were quite out there. The Indians weren't the possessores bona fide of the land they sold or donated. Also, had all the natives of said land even had a voice about the contracts of the pretended sale? Also, the English owned the true title to the land because it was justified by first discovery. In England, this claim meant that once an English explorer set foot on land, England owned all the soil stretching out from it. John Cabot, sailing under an English flag, had set foot on Newfoundland in 1497. Cute, but Cabot stepped on an island. And by that reasoning, the Italians stepped on the mainland even earlier. Or even the French, who had hired Giovanni da Verrazzano to explore, who apparently entered the New Amsterdam harbor over a century ago. And do we even need to mention the Spanish? The Dutch legal basis for ownership was that after an explorer set foot on land, he had to chart it and occupy it. That's why the company scattered the early settlers to all the corners of New Netherland. Meanwhile, King Charles figured that the only way to boost English trade was to make peace with Spain and France. So, he began negotiations. King Felipe IV of Spain, in a perpetual state of brokenness, hoped that once the English cut the rebels off, the Dutch Republic would give up the war, and the rebel North and the loyal South would reunite, peace in all the lands. The end. Like that was ever gonna happen. In November 1630, King Charles concluded peace with Spain, and, following in the footsteps of his dad, King James, he started kissing up to Felipe to become besties and marry off his kids to the Spanish kids, so they could become one big happy family. The Republic was big mad that the king had simply reneged on their treaties, but when King Charles seized the Spanish ships that the Dutch privateers brought into English ports, they were downright furious. Did Spain put you up to this? No. While we're at it, could you cut it out with the whole Amboina massacre thing? These slanderous pamphlets created a division between the Dutch and English everywhere. Yeah, no. Charles had become a free press advocate overnight. So, the Dutch printed pamphlets in English to counter these massacre claims. There'd been a trial, people pleaded guilty, it was all legit. Meanwhile, the English's pamphlets proclaiming the Amboina incident a brutal massacre did have an interesting side effect. English merchants got so spooked about the dangerous, devious, dickish Dutch that they gave up on the East Indies entirely and focused on India instead. For the West India Company, New Netherland was an afterthought. A nice bonus port, but the fur trade wasn't making them any money. In fact, the colony ran at a loss. No, the real money was in the sugar and salt trade in South America and the Caribbean. And that's where they sent all their military forces to seize and preserve the colonies. However, now that the English king had openly claimed New Netherland, they had to do something to preserve it. The Amsterdam Chamber's idealist colony faction won from the realist trade-only faction. Send over the colonists. Well, the Republic's residents were quite comfy and free at home. There were plenty of jobs, and no one felt a particular calling to build a home in a farawayville wilderness on behalf of some commercial company. Nor were they interested in bringing God to the foreign peoples. Some company directors put their heads together and concocted a cunning plan to make the colony profitable without the company spending a dime. They were going medieval and bring back fiefdoms. The Republic had 3 classes: the high-ranking nobility, aka landowners, the burghers who governed the cities, and the common folk. The burghers were raking in money from trade, and many of them had more wealth than noblemen. While they could afford to buy land and get a noble status, there was no land left in the Republic for them to buy. On January 13, 1629, some company directors suggested buying unappropriated land from the Indians in New Netherland and establish their own private colonies, aka fiefdoms, which came with a title. So it was done. The company established het Handvest van Vrijheden en Exemptien, Charter of Freedoms and Exemptions, which granted for that time powerful rights and privileges to patroons, who could buy tracts of land called patroonschappen and bring over people, or serfs, to work on the land. The patroon title was hereditary. Among other things, a patroon could make laws, establish courts, appoint local officers and magistrates, punish all crimes committed within their fiefdom, and even execute criminals. They owed allegiance directly to the States General, not the West India Company. There were conditions. They had 4 years to establish a settlement and bring in at least 50 families who would live as tenant farmers. Patroons had to provide free transportation for these families. They could buy the right to trade fur at a 5% tax, but they had to use the company's agents at Manhattan to export these goods. Kiliaan van Rensselaer, an Amsterdam diamond merchant, was one of the founding directors of the West India Company. In August 1630, he hired Bastiaan Krol to buy land surrounding Fort Orange from the Mahican and called it Renselaarswijk. A wijk is a district. Board member Michiel Reinierszoon Pauw secured a tract that spans today's Staten Island, Hoboken, and Hudson County, New Jersey, and named it Pavonia, a Latinization of his surname Pauw, meaning peacock. Board member Samuel Blommaert bought 2 patroonships on the fresh, now Connecticut River. Board member Albert Koenraadszoon Burg started one on the eastern bank of the South, now Delaware River, and board member Samuel Godijn bought a patroonship in present-day Lewis, Delaware, and called it Swanendaal, Valley of the Swans, or as the Indians called it, Sicones. Some patroons also gained patroonships in the Caribbean. You may have noticed a trend. All patroons were company board members. Company board members who concocted the idea of patroonships. Shareholders never even had a chance. This was insider trading. The shareholders were mad. The West India Company was forced to backpedal their plan. Fine, cut the program. Shareholders were still mad. The company ordered patroons to make other company shareholders their partners, unleashing a bureaucratic nightmare. But shareholders were still mad and turned on director Peter Minuit, who'd been on the patroon's side, and must have helped them cheat everyone else out of getting their precious land and titles. Reverend Michaelius, who already didn't like Minuit's interference in his church, escalated the fight by launching a smear campaign against the director. The new company's secretary, Jan van Raamunde, sided with the Reverend. And then Michaelius escalated the whole thing further by telling the company board that their director had gone dark side and, well, some said he was trying to cheat the company. Well, the company wanted to have a little chat with Minuit, Michaelius and van Raamunde, and in 1631 they recalled them all to the Netherlands. Bastiaan Krol was left in charge as the provisional director of the colony. Mortal enemies Minuit and Michaelius boarded the Eendracht, the Unity, with van Raamunde and got to enjoy each other's company in tight quarters on the 2-month journey home. Weather willing. The weather wasn't willing. Off the coast of England, the Eendracht was caught in a storm and they had to make an emergency landing at Plymouth. And the English were like, "Oh look, pretty things, 5,000 furs." The authorities arrested and imprisoned the director and the Reverend. The Dutch were like, "Did Spain put you up to this?" Nope. The English had seized the Dutch vessel on the grounds that its cargo came from a certain plantation usurped by them in the north parts of Virginia, which they say was acquired from the natives of the country. Confusion. Dutch traders never entered English territory, not south, not north. Surely this was a mistake. Well, King Charles said that while the territorial claim was in dispute, the ship crew, cargo, and passengers remained in England. You got nothing. Charles could claim the land for England until the cows came home. The Dutch were simply more powerful, and the king had no money to do anything about it. Eventually, the ship and the prisoners were released. On May 3, 1631, Peter Minuit stomped into the West India Company's Amsterdam Chamber building. What do you want to know? There are no records left of this meeting, but we know the outcome. Minuit was fired. The reason given? Because he hadn't brought in enough settlers, and he had prevented shareholders from getting patroonships. This was all nonsense, of course. An enraged Minuit repeated the ousted director Willem Verhulst's threat, which had come to nothing. He'd take a foreign army and use his knowledge of the territory to invade New Netherland to start his own colony. Well, kids, he did. Spoilers. It became clear to all the Indian tribes that the swarming Swanakans slowly swallowed the land. And these patroons weren't just using and sharing the land, they treated it as if they owned it and started lording over the natives. It's that they still brought useful stuff and the trade relations were peaceful that no one did anything. The two cultures influenced each other. Indians started dressing in duffel instead of deerskin, and the Dutch copied the Indians' agricultural tactics, growing corn in particular. And, well, men and women from tribes on either side of the aisle fell in love. But such relations were frowned upon, and eventually forbidden by the Dutch. In the Republic, patroon Samuel Gordijn approached Captain, Artilleryman, and VOC upper merchant David Pieterszoon de Vries if he wanted to become an under-patroon and help establish colonies. De Vries was like, make me equal patroon and I'm in. Now 5 patroons, Gordijn, Van Rensselaer, Blommaert, Johannes de Laat and de Vries, entered into a North American patroon pact to pool their resources. In December 1630, Gordijn sent Pieter Heijers with the Walvis, the whale, and the yacht the Salm, salmon, laden with farmers and building materials to his patroon ship in Tortuga in the Caribbean. They found it in ruins after a Spanish attack. After the ships dropped off some settlers, they headed for Zwanendaal in New Netherland, where the settlers built Fort Opland and surrounded it with palisades. They mounted a tin plate with an image of Holland on a pole and announced that the Dutch claimed the territory by rights of discovery, purchase and occupation. In April 1631, Gordijn sent the Walvis to Zwanendaal to drop off 28 Dutch immigrants, cattle and whaling equipment. The place was to be a whaling and fishing colony on account of the many whales in the Godenis, now Delaware Bay. In May 1632, Captain de Vries commanded a 2-ship expedition, the Walvis and the Eekhoorn Squirrel, to drop off additional immigrants and whaling supplies at Zwanendaal. But just as de Vries was about to set sail, he received word that the colony had been wiped out. De Vries set out, hoping the story of Zwanendaal's demise was greatly exaggerated. On December 6, 1632, Captain David de Vries reached Zwanendaal in New Netherland. No one came to greet them. No smoke came from the chimneys. The Walvis crew, armed to the teeth, rowed ashore to explore. They found the fort burned to ash and the bones of their murdered countrymen and cattle scattered everywhere. They returned to the Walvis. De Vries fired one of the ship's heavy cannons, hoping the noise would draw the attention of some friendly Indian who could tell him what had happened. The following morning, they noticed a column of smoke near the ruined fort. De Vries and crew rowed up the creek but saw no one. De Vries told one of his men to shoot at a flock of seagulls, which roused a few Indians asleep at the fort. Neither group trusted the other, with the Dutch fearing an arrow ambush and the Indians fearing a rain of the strangers' bullets. De Vries said they'd return the following day with the yacht and wanted to talk to them. On December 8th, one of the Indians dared to come closer, and assured by the Dutch's friendly gestures, climbed aboard. He was given some cloth as a peace offering. More Indians came aboard to get cloth. One of them stayed the night and explained what had happened to the colony. One of their chiefs naively had taken down the shiny tin plate the Dutch had attached to the pole to make tobacco pipes from it. The fort's commander, Gilles Houssaye, was furious. This prompted some Indians, eager to remain in Houssaye's favor, to kill the chief and bring a body part, probably his head, to the commander. Whoa! He didn't mean that. He only wanted to reprimand the man and tell him not to do it again. Others in the tribe fumed at the unjust execution of their chief, which they believed the fort's commander had ordered. They swore vengeance. A group of warriors went up to the fort where 32 men, save Hauset and one sick man, were working in the fields. 3 Indians concealed their weapons as best they could and approached the fort. "Wanna trade some beaver skins?" Hauset kindly invited them in. They wouldn't have dared come closer if the mastiff hadn't been chained up near the door. When the commander returned with goods from the storeroom in the attic, one of the men struck him dead with an axe. They then killed the sick man and shot 25 arrows into the chained-up mastiff. They headed out to the colonists working in the field, making friendly gestures, but at a signal, each hit their marked man with arrows and war clubs. Minutes later, everyone was dead. De Vries figured the guilty were probably long gone by now, and he wasn't about to kill the innocent. It was best for the Dutch to enter into a formal treaty of peace. The following day, he made an alliance with the chiefs of the tribe, who were very relieved the Dutch weren't vengeful. De Vries now sailed up the South River through the floating ice to Fort Nassau, across from present-day Philadelphia. Save for a few soldiers, the area was also deserted of all colonists. As he made his way up the South River, De Vries entertained 9 different tribes on board, who vowed to have friendly intentions. Every tribe entered into a formal treaty with the Dutch. De Vries left the South River and the land that no one apparently wanted to cultivate or occupy, and headed for the Fresh River to hunt more whales. While everyone was working their darndest to keep the New Netherland colony up and running, their boss, aka the West India Company, was doing everything to run the whole operation into the ground. De Heren 19 were losing money hand over fist trying to hold on to Dutch Brazil, while the Amsterdam Chamber, responsible for the New Netherland colony, couldn't agree on whether they were running a trading colony or a settlers colony, so they ran neither, and didn't appear particularly bothered to find the best director to run the place. They ended up appointing Wouter van Twille, a young company clerk with no particular set of skills other than being married to a niece of patroon Kilian van Rensselaer. In the spring of 1633, Van Twille arrived in New Netherland on the Zoutberg, Salt Mountain, with weapons, ammo, 52 sailors, and a military force of 104 soldiers, Fort Amsterdam's first military garrison. The director also brought a new reverend, Everardus Bogardus, and the first schoolteacher, Adam Roelandsen. The new director had orders to improve trade relations with the natives and to send more furs, but he made it rain company money. The horse mill attic that served as the colony's church had become too small for the growing congregation. So, a crude wooden church building went up with a house and stable for the reverend built right next to it. The decrepit Fort Amsterdam, what was left of it, was repaired. The new director spent another few thousand guilders constructing a guardhouse and a barracks inside the ramparts for the newly arrived soldiers. He also made plans for a boathouse with a sailmaker's loft. Miller, François Molenmaker, built 2 more mills at the southernmost tip of Manhattan, a grain mill and a lumber mill, but they were placed out of the wind, so useful. Van Twiller had brick and frame houses built for the director and other company officers. Smaller houses were built for the corporal, cooper, smith, and midwife. He also widened the main path, the trade route into town, and called it Herenstraat, Gentleman Street. Later, the English renamed it Broadway, though the street got a little rerouted over the years. While many immigrants arrived during Van Twiller's administration, nearly all were traders looking to make a quick buck and scram. Since only a few settlers were farmers, the colony remained dependent on supplies from the Republic, and the shipping costs they had to use West India Company ships were huge. It would be better for colonization if there wasn't a trade monopoly anymore. No one wanted to settle in a place where they had to pay exorbitant shipping fees. On April 16, 1633, Captain David de Vries, who'd swung by Jamestown, Virginia for a bit, sailed into New Amsterdam Harbor. 2 days later, Captain Jacob Eelkens had anchored his English ship the William before Fort Amsterdam. Eelkens, who had been the New Netherland Company commander at the old Fort Nassau, had been dismissed in 1623 for conduct unbecoming in regard to the natives. Some London merchants engaged him on account of his fur trade knowledge. Ilkens didn't care about Dutch sovereignty. I'ma sail upriver and trade with the Indians. When Director Van Twiller said no, Ilkens claimed the place was discovered by an Englishman, David Hudson. So, English. De Vries countered, Henry Hudson, and he was sailing under the Dutch East India Company flag. Well, Ilkens would sail upriver even if it cost him his life. Van Twiller ordered the Dutch flag to be run up at Fort Amsterdam and fired a 3-cannon salute in honor of the Prince of Orange. Ilkens unfurled the English flag at his mast and fired a 3-cannon salute in honor of King Charles. Van Twiller went on board, drank with the captain, and became so drunk that de Vries was like, "I'm embarrassed for you." 6 days later, Van Twiller officially refused the William a license to sail up the river. Ilkens was like, "Whatever," and sailed toward Fort Orange, making the William the first vessel to carry the English flag up the North Mauritius Hudson River. The director was so enraged, he started drinking. He told the soldiers and company officials to come to his house, where he cried out for those who loved the Prince of Orange and him to join him and protect him from the violence of the intrepid Englishman. Everyone cheered and drank. De Vries was like, "Are you serious right now?" While the men merrily downed another 7 casks of beer, the William merrily sailed toward Fort Orange. During lunch, De Vries told off the director. "You have committed a great folly. Had it been my case, I would have sent the Englishman from the fort with some 8-pound iron beans and prevented him from going up the river. If the English committed any excesses against us in the East Indies, we would strike back at them, because one cannot control that nation. The English are of so haughty a nature that they think everything belongs to them. If it were my case, I would send the ship Zoutberg after them and drive them out of the river." Now Van Twiller got his feefies hurt and jumped into action. He sent 3 well-armed vessels manned with soldiers after the intruders. They found the William about a mile below Fort Orange, where they pitched a tent and had been making fur trade deals for 2 weeks. The Dutch ordered Ilkens to strike his tent. Ilkens would not, so they did it for him. They seized all his trading goods and purchased furs, and ushered the William, its captain and crew, past Fort Amsterdam into the ocean. Ilkens returned to London. Thus ended England's first attempt at trade with the Indians in New Netherland. The director seemed to have found his inner tyrant and blocked de Vries's yacht the Eekhoorn from sailing upriver on a trading mission, by right of visitation to check if de Vries wasn't defrauding the company. However, it was entirely within the patroon's right to have a ship sail upriver to trade, but Van Twiller ordered the guns of Fort Amsterdam to be trained on the little vessel. De Vries raced up to the fort's bastion, where the director, his secretary Cornelis van Tienhoven, and a few council members stood. "Is this land full of fools? Why did you not shoot when the Englishman violated your river?" The embarrassed director withdrew his order, and Eekhoorntje could leave. De Vries fumed that the company officials were a bunch of noobs. They know nothing but about drinking. In the East Indies they would not serve for assistance, but the West India Company sends out at once as great masters of folks persons who never had any command before. Therefore it must come to naught. Well, I do have to point out that de Vries here isn't an entirely reliable narrator. He had a tendency to exaggerate his own awesomeness. He never even mentioned Van Twiller's men going after Ilkens, and it appears he was after Van Twiller's job. Either way, Van Twiller's fickle leadership made him unpopular fast. Reverend Bogardus felt called to threaten him with such a shake from the pulpit as would make him shudder. "Preach, brother, preach, from your lips to the company's ears." Director Wouter van Twiller heard from David de Vries that the English were moving into the Connecticut area, and quickly bought land on both sides of the Fresh, or Connecticut River, to strengthen the Dutch claim. He built a trading post at the mouth of the stream called Kievietshoek, and a little upriver a redoubt called Thuis de Hope, the House de Hope, also called Fort Goede Hope, near today's Hartford. Governor William Bradford of New Plymouth Colony and Governor John Winthrop of Massachusetts Bay Colony heard that the Dutch had taken formal possession of the Connecticut Valley. Is that ours or nah? They didn't know, so they let it slide. Besides, Winthrop dismissed the area as not fit for plantation, there being 3,000 or 4,000 warlike Indians, these Indians being the Pequot. Back in 1631, Podunk chief Wajinakut had visited Winthrop and invited him to start a new settlement in the Connecticut River Valley, saying he wanted protection from that feared and hated Pequot tribe. But in the summer of 1633, the governor was looking for more farmland for his colonists, so he sent a little exploration committee to the area. Winthrop was told the place was extremely fertile. Since the Dutch only had Fort Goede Hoop and had neglected to put boweries or settlements anywhere, the governor was like, ours. The land was too good to stand idle. Director Van Twiller urged Governor Winthrop to wait for the King of England and the States General to make a boundary agreement, so that the colonists of both nations might live as good neighbors in these heathenish countries. Meanwhile, the New Plymouth governor swooped in and was like, ours. Bradford bought a tract of land just above Fort Goede Hoop from Indians who had just been driven from their homes by the old victorious Pequot and sent Lieutenant George Holmes over to establish a fortified house on it. But the Dutch had orders not to let anyone pass Fort Goede Hoop up the river. Holmes was like, shoot me if you will, but I'm going. Fort Goede Hoop and its small garrison were less than useless, and Holmes passed. Van Twiller sent a commissioner to tell Holmes and his people, shoo, shoo. But the lieutenant replied, I'm here in the name of the King of England, and here I shall remain. Meanwhile, things got even more complicated. When Fort Goede Hoop was constructed, the Dutch specified in their treaty with the Pequot that the trading post was to be open to all tribes. But the Pequot were like treaty schmeedy and attacked a rival tribe who wanted to trade. The Dutch retaliated by kidnapping the Pequot sachem, Tatowem, who had come aboard to trade, and held him for ransom. The Pequot paid the ransom, and the Dutch handed them Tatowem's corpse. Now the Niantic attacked a ship they claimed was Dutch, but they probably knew was English. Its captain, John Stone, and 7 of his men from Boston were killed. This rattled the English a bit, but no one liked John Stone, so The colonial officials only protested the killing. The Pequot refused to hand over the killer for trial and punishment and offered a repayment. They simply handed Massachusetts Bay the North Connecticut Valley. Meanwhile, the company ordered Van Twiller to do something about the English interlopers. The director sent a force of 70 well-armed men to force Lieutenant Holmes and his men out. Shoo! Shoo! No. Okay, bye. Then Holmes and some 15 Englishmen headed out to seize the now abandoned Dutch fort. Van Twiller sent an armed vessel, arrested the whole company, brought them to Manhattan, and then sent them pack and sack to an English settlement on the Chesapeake. But the English kept sneaking into Connecticut in search of pastures for their cattle. There was no stopping them. They justified their actions by saying, like the banks of the Hudson, the Connecticut had first been explored and even occupied by the Dutch. But should a log hut and a few straggling soldiers seal a territory against other emigrants? Eventually, the Massachusetts Bay Colony did establish Hartford on the land they'd been invited to. They bought the land, but they had no royal charter. In April 1638, Reverend John Davenport and London merchant Theophilus Eaton led 500 Puritans from the Massachusetts Bay Colony to establish New Haven on the bay below Fort Goede Hoop on land bought from the Quinnipiacs for a pledge of protection against the neighboring Pequot. But they didn't have a royal charter either. Now fights broke out between the New Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonists, each trying to establish settlements, as the English continued to crowd out the Dutch. As if English encroachment wasn't enough, now the French demanded a piece of the action. The New Netherland colony had a second city, village, fort. Fort Orange, near present-day Albany, was the fur trade hub. All the pelts coming down from the Mohawk Valley were stored at the fort before being shipped to New Amsterdam. But in 1634, the flow of fur slowed dramatically. So, the French had headed south and made fur trade deals with the Indians, undercutting the Dutch contracts. New Netherland was completely dependent on the fur trade, so someone had to go deep into the interior, have a little chat with the Mohawk, and convince them that the Dutch were the better trading partners. The situation was so urgent, it couldn't wait until spring. On December 11, 1634, 22-year-old barber surgeon Harmen Meinertzoon van den Boogaard, merchant Hieronymus de la Croix, and sailor Willem Thomassen got the mission. Van den Boogaard had arrived in New Amsterdam in 1629 as a card-carrying member of the Barber Surgeon Guild. He not only shaved beards, but also amputated limbs, did bloodletting, and all kinds of surgical things. He journaled his journey into the interior, granting us a rare glimpse inside Mohawk villages, and gave us the first ever Mohawk dictionary. In the middle of the winter, Van den Boogaard, Delacroix and Thomassen, their packs stuffed with food and presents such as knives and scissors, followed 5 Mohawk guides and their dogs. They made decent headway into the wilderness, but during the first night, Van den Boogaard woke up just in time to see the guides silently preparing to leave camp without them. Team New Netherland grabbed their things and hurried to catch up. Oh, by the way, the Indians' dogs had eaten their meat and cheese. All they had left was bread. They hiked for days, plowing through deep snow and wind, with the occasional bear and elk sighting. On December 20th, chilled to the bone, they came to a stream that was running very hard, with many large chunks of ice, so that we were in great danger. Had one of us fallen, it would have been the end. But the Lord God protected us and we made it across. We were soaked up to the waist. At last, they reached their first Mohawk village on a hilltop surrounded by a palisade. There were large wooden homes set up in a kind of street pattern. Some houses had signs of European interaction, like iron hinges, bolts, and chains. People were alternately curious and fearful, but gave Team New Netherland baked pumpkin, beans, venison, and gifts. That night, Surgeon Van den Boogaard cut open Thomassen's leg to relieve swelling caused by the long, cold march and smeared the cut with bear grease. They traveled onward and upward, encountering villages along the way. At every village, the people asked them to shoot their firearms. The thundering guns excited the crowds. One chief invited Team New Netherland into his house, placed far away from the village because of the smallpox that affected many Indians in the region. Neither side knew that the Europeans had brought it over. Eventually, Team New Netherland made their way to the most important village where they would negotiate. When Team New Netherland arrived at the Mohawk capital village, its residents welcomed them by forming 2 long lines outside the village gate. After the men were fed and entertained, they huddled together with 46 Haudenosaunee tribal members and chiefs. It was a bit snug, and started negotiating. One of the chiefs told the visitors off for not bringing the proper presents. Look, the French gave us shirts and coats, see? Uh-oh. Then one of the Indians started to scream, calling them scoundrels. The situation got so intense that Willem Thomassen, a hardened sailor, burst into angry tears. At last, Van den Boogaard yelled back. The Indian chuckled. Dude, chill. It was all a misunderstanding. You must not be angry. We are happy that you've come here. Then an old man stepped up and put his hand on Van den Boogaard's chest. A regular heartbeat. This man was not afraid. Apparently, Van den Boogaard had passed some kind of test. So, let's talk alliances. The Mohawk liked the Dutch more than the French, who were allied with the Huron, whom they feared. The Mohawk offered their terms. Henceforth, each beaver pelt would be worth 4 hands of sawant and 4 hands of cloth. 4 hands of sawant from outstretched hand, from thumb to pinky. When Van den Boogaard didn't respond, an Onondaga chief spoke. You've not said whether we shall have 4 hands or not. Well, he wasn't empowered to finalize a deal, but promised to return in the spring with an answer. Fair, but that it better not be a lie. Once they got their 4 hands, they shall trade our pelts with no one else. The agreement was concluded with a chant naming the 5 tribes of the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee League: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Van den Boogaard took all the notes. Back in New Netherland, everyone figured Team New Netherland was done for, but lo and behold, in late January 1635, they walked into Fort Orange. The deal with the Mohawk was finalized that spring, and the furs were paddled down the rivers again. The French can suck it. Meanwhile, the West India Company was busy elsewhere, conquering trading posts in West Africa, the Caribbean, and South America. The company directors were salivating at its intoxicating array of goods. Sugar, salt, dyewood, tobacco, copper, oh my! The company men captured several islands in the Caribbean like Saba, Curaçao, Aruba, Bonaire, and Sint Eustatius. Most are still part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands today. The company was well pleased. Curaçao's port was better than any Spanish mainland port. The island also had a ton of useful natural resources, such as cattle, lime, fuel, and Campeche wood, a raw material for natural paint. Still, holding on to and expanding Dutch Brazil proved hard, because the Moradores, Portuguese white, black, and native soldiers, waged a guerrilla war against the Dutch leaders, who proved to be mighty incompetent. Many of the once so profitable sugar plantations were destroyed in the war, and the war for Brazil was very spendy. By 1636, the WIC had a debt of 18 million guilders. The company finally caught on to the idea that maybe, just a thought, they should put a strong military leader in charge of their colonies, just like the ones ruling the East Indies. So in August 1636, the West India Company appointed a governor-general. It was Prince Frederik Hendrik's cousin, the 33-year-old Johan Maurits Fürst von Nassau-Siegen, who had earned his stripes in the 80 Years' War. The company also sent 3,000 troops along for the defense of Dutch Brazil. Johan Maurits presided over the Hogen en Secreten Raad, a high council, and became the commander-in-chief over the company's Brazil army and fleet. The man got to work the moment he arrived in January 1637. He went south, then north, and pushed out the Portuguese everywhere, capturing all the places. By the end of the year, nearly half of Brazil was in Dutch hands. Johan Maurits was called the Brazilian. However, reigniting the sugar trade hit a snag. While the Governor-General offered the Moradores and all the people in the colony religious freedom, the company's trade monopoly in the area created problems. The company couldn't afford to send any goods over to supply its colonists with, everything. Just like in New Amsterdam, no one wanted to settle in a place where they had to pay exorbitant shipping fees. A discussion raged about opening up the place to free trade. The Amsterdam Chamber said the company could never properly supply Brazil. If they wanted to hold on to the place, they had to allow private trade. Johan Maurits also believed free trade was the way to go, and so in May 1638, the Amsterdam directors finally managed to convince all the chambers to end the monopoly. The Dutch moved heaven and earth to remain on good terms with the Indians all around them. The English, not so much. While the Dutch traveled into the woods and encouraged Indians to come be our guest on Manhattan, the English kept the natives at arm's length. If an Indian even looked at them wrong, they immediately went on the offensive. Well, it worked. Their force had kept the peace for 40 whole years. But the fur trade had been causing problems between the tribes aligned with the English, and the tribes aligned with the Dutch, and the tribes aligned with the French, unleashing the Beaver Wars. One group of Englishmen had already died because of the conflicts, and then a Narragansett allegedly killed another exiled English trader named John Oldham on Block Island. The Pequot gave the killer sanctuary, but worried about retaliations, they started peace talks. While Oldham wasn't loved either, the English chose violence. In August 1636, John Endicott and 90 men attacked 2 Niantic villages on Block Island to avenge Oldham's death. Few got hurt, but the militia burned the village to the ground, looted the winter crops, and destroyed what they couldn't carry. When a Pequot village refused to hand over the Stone and Oldham killers, Endicott attacked, burned, and looted their villages. Now the Pequot chose violence. They besieged Fort Saybrook and raided various Connecticut towns. Wethersfield lost about 30 settlers. The English launched a counterattack and got the support of the Pequot enemies, the Mohegan and the Narragansett tribes, who figured a war might weaken their enemies. One fateful morning, May 26, 1637, Captains John Mason and John Underhill attacked one of the 2 fortified Pequot villages at Mystic. They set the place on fire and killed hundreds of Pequot men, women, and children. Those who tried to escape were shot or captured and sold into slavery. The Mohegan and Narragansett allies were horrified by the manner of the Englishmen's fight because it's too furious and slays too many men. The Mystic Massacre broke the Pequot spirit. Its leader fled and sought refuge with the Mohawk near New Netherland. However, the Mohawk murdered him and his bodyguard, sending his head and hands to Hartford. On September 21, 1638, the Treaty of Hartford ended the Pequot tribe. It declared the tribe dissolved, banning the use of their name, and forbidding survivors from re-establishing their society. English colonists now had a model on how to deal with the native tribes in the future. Shoot first, and you'll never have to ask questions. The Dutch took all the notes. The Lutheran king of Sweden, Gustav II Adolf of Sverige, was knee-deep in the Swedish intervention part of what would become known as the 30 Years' War, next door to the Netherlands' 80 Years' War in the Habsburg Empire. He saw Spain, England, France, and the Dutch Republic taking over the world and wanted in on the action. But alas, he died at the Battle of Lützen around the same time Peter Minuit returned to Old Amsterdam. Gustav's 6-year-old daughter, Christina, was crowned Queen of Sweden, but the man in charge of the country was Axel Gustafsson Oxenstierna. He continued Gustav's policies. One day, Oxenstierna met Samuel Blommaert, one of the directors of the West India Company, who was there to trade copper. Blommaert was livid about the company's botched handling of its North American colony. His own patroonship had fallen victim to company bureaucracy. He'd been planning to sidestep them and told Oxenstierna, "So, want to build a snowman? Establish a colony within New Netherlands territory? Because I got just a man for the job." The disgraced and disgruntled former director of New Netherlands, Peter Minuit, who knew the Dutch colony better than anyone alive. For instance, he knew the South River Territory was left pretty much unguarded. Fort Nassau was practically abandoned, so they could sneak in unnoticed and take it all. Mwahaha! In March 1638, Peter Minuit returned to North America on the Kalmar Nyckel, Key of Kalmar, all dressed in armor like a soldier going to battle. But he was pretty sure no one would greet him. He sailed into what is now Delaware Bay, dropped anchor on the Minquas Kill is Dutch for sheltered gully, and went on land with Dutch sailors and Swedish soldiers, pike and muskets at the ready, at what is today called Swedes Landing in Wilmington, Delaware. Land that the West India Company had clearly abandoned. Fort Nassau at the Schuylkill on the South River on the New Jersey side was on the wrong side of the river. Indians couldn't really reach it. Minuit used his land-buying experience to purchase territories below the Schuylkill on the western Delaware shore, the right side of the river, on behalf of the 12-year-old Queen Christina of Sweden. There, Minuit built Fort Christina, giving the Swedes the hip and happening new trading posts in the area. He cleverly called together the local tribal chiefs in his ship's cabin and convinced them to sign a deed. Not for the benefit of the Indians. He nor the Swedish government couldn't care less about the Indians' claims, but to neener any future legal disputes with the Dutch. Meanwhile, everyone and their mother complained to the West India Company about Director Van Twiller's incompetence. According to Reverend Bogardus and Fiscaal Lubbert van Dinklagen, he was a perpetual drunk who neglected all colony business and only worked to enrich himself. Case in point, he was said to be the richest landowner in the province. The Amsterdam Chamber was not amused. They never got news from the colony from Van Twiller directly, always from others. But when rumors reached them that he planned to buy land with company money for himself, the company recalled him. 2 weeks after former New Netherland director Peter Minuit sneaked in to stake the Swedish claim on the southern part of the colony, a new director for New Netherland arrived, Willem Kieft. Kieft, born and raised in Amsterdam, was the son of a merchant and a politician's daughter, so he had excellent family connections. His cousin, Willem van Ruitenburg, was featured in Rembrandt van Rijn's Schutters van Wijk 2 onder kapitein Frans Banning-Kok en luitenant Willem van Ruitenburg, a.k.a. the Nachtwacht, a.k.a. the Night Watch. He's the guy in the middle, in the dashing yellow ensemble. However, Kieft was a bit of a black sheep in the family. It was said that after his business in France failed, a picture of him was pinned to the gallows in La Rochelle, and he was forced to flee. He ended up in the Ottoman Empire, tasked with ransoming Christians who'd been taken prisoner by the Sultan. Some claim that Kieft turned it into a for-profit venture by buying the release only of those captives who had the smallest price on their heads, leaving the others to languish in Ottoman jails and pocketing the difference. The directors picked him, Lord knows why. It could have been his cunning. It could have been that they were simply that desperate for a replacement because the man wasn't a politician, he wasn't a military man, and he'd never set foot in either East or West Indies. New Amsterdam was a corporate town, but many had moved on from the company. The settlement could do with a little sprucing up on the political and justice front. Well, they got Kieft, so that's a no. In the spring of 1638, the new director arrived at New Amsterdam with orders to straighten out the failing business. He was given all the powers akin to a military dictator, even of life and death. And boy, did the man run with it. I mean, run with it. He ruled like a lord ruled his serfs in his fiefdom. Everyone had to do as they were told. His word was law, and there were no legal appeals. While this type of military rule worked elsewhere, as long as they were reasonable rulers, Kieft's rule was extremely arbitrary and unpredictable. The fort was still in decay, its cannons had been dismounted, the church and company headquarters were in disrepair, and of the 3 windmills, one was useless and one was burnt to the ground. Among the residents, morals had gone out the window. And, worst of all, as far as the company was concerned, people engaged in private fur trading. So, Kieft ordered the buildings fixed, reintroduced morals and values, and banned private trade. He reorganized the administration and kept Cornelis van Tienhoven on as the company secretary. Kieft realized the people wanted at least some say in the company's decision-making, so, to shut them up, he expanded the informal Council of 9 to a formal Council of 12 to assist him. Everyone had 1 vote. Kieft, also a council member, had 2. Decisions were made by majority rule. Naturally, he selected mostly people indebted to the company, aka yes-men. When he had a bit of time, he turned his gaze south, to his predecessor and the damn Swedes. The few soldiers stationed at the lone Fort Nassau on the South River reported to Director Kieft in Manhattan about Peter Minuit's arrival. Kieft was confused. What was Sweden, an ally in the war against Spain, doing challenging Dutch sovereignty? The director sent a message to the ex-director. I, Willem Kieft, Director General of New Netherland, residing on the island of the Manhattas and in Fort Amsterdam, under the authority of their High Mightinesses, the Lord States General of the United Netherlands, and the Incorporated West India Company Chamber at Amsterdam, make known to you, Peter Minuit, who style yourself commander in the service of Her Royal Majesty of Sweden, that the whole South River of New Netherland has been many years in our possession, and secured by us above and below by forts, and sealed with our blood, which even happened during your administration of New Netherland and is well known to you. The letter went on to say that Kieft didn't believe the Queen of Sweden had given Minuit permission to invade the Dutch space, and any damages incurred from building forts and trade would be repaid. At some point. Soonish. So, no immediate threat then. Minuit ignored the summons. He knew the Dutch had no soldiers to spare to chase them away. The ex-director completed Fort Christina, garrisoned it with 25 men, and sailed off to Stockholm to suggest more colonization options. He hoped to inspire those downtrodden and weary of the 30 Years' War to resettle in New Sweden. Alas, in August 1638, while in the Caribbean to buy tobacco to trade in Europe, Peter Minuit died in a hurricane. As Minuit had predicted, Director Kieft never made a move against New Sweden. The Swedes were here to stay, until a more uncompromising director came to town. With the English crowding in from above, the Swedes seizing land to the south, New Netherland was shrinking. Since the West India Company only cared about trade and couldn't be bothered to install a proper government, New Netherland was on the verge of collapse. The colony's residents were mere servants of a multinational company, and any newcomers were only interested in making a quick buck, smuggle, whore, and be gone. There was no rule of law, and New Amsterdam devolved into ruinous chaos, with barroom knife fights, private trade, and soldiers sleeping with Indian women while on guard duty. At last, the States General decided to step in to end the colony's mismanagement. New Netherland shouldn't be filled with company dependents, and the States General suggested that the WIC give up New Netherland, making it a colony of the Republic. The company was horrified and offered to give up its monopoly instead. The patroons also had a few ideas. They wanted to expand their freedoms and exemptions, monopolize more territory, have more time to build their patroonships, enjoy free trade, be given more powers, have a vote in the council, and to be supplied with slaves and convicts from the Republic to serve as workers. In fact, all private persons and poor immigrants should fall under their jurisdiction. The States General were in shock at the very concept and just went with the company giving up the monopoly thing. In 1639, the States General abolished the exclusive privilege of the West India Company in New Netherland. From now on, New Netherland was a free trade zone, and the Hudson River was open for business from everywhere. Individual colonists could join the trade and cultivate farms. And just like that, everything changed. Settlers moved down from the northern English colonies, up from the southern English colonies, and over from Europe. From the rich to the poor, the educated and the uneducated alike, all made their way to the areas under Dutch control. Director Kieft and the company, still responsible for running the place, were utterly unprepared for this free-for-all.